Good evening, guys. I've got discussion D for you. Tonight we are discussing the foods people consistently eat in their 40s strongly shapes their odds of reaching their 70s with good physical, cognitive, and mental health. Okay? Basically, healthy aging. Okay? So we'll go through that for D. So please join me for tonight's presentation, D. Here we go. The article builds this case by walking through a large decades long Harvard study and showing how midlife dietary patterns were linked to healthy aging later on. What the text is saying in context. The surrounding page explains that researchers followed more than 106,000 adults for 30 years, starting when they were around 40. Every 4 years, participants reported what they ate. Researchers then compared those diets to several well-established healthy eating patterns, including the DASH diet, emphasizes vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and low sodium. Alternative Healthy Eating Index, or AHEI, encourages legumes, nuts, vegetables, and limits red processed meats. Planetary health diets, plant forward with modest animal products. The strongest link to healthy aging come from the AHEI pattern, but all three showed benefits. What healthy aging means in this study. The page defines healthy aging as reaching at least age 70 with all of the following: good cognitive function, good mental health, good physical function. No major chronic diseases, heart disease, diabetes, stroke, kidney failure, and most cancers. Only about 9% of participants achieve this. But those who ate the healthiest diets in midlife had 43% to 84% higher odds of aging well. The core message. The surrounding content makes the meaning of the headline very explicit. Higher intake of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, legumes. Unsalted fats and low dietary, better odds of healthier aging. Higher intake of trans fats, sodium, red meat, and processed meats, lower odds. The article also stresses that diet doesn't work in isolation. People who eat well often also exercise more, have better access to care, and live in healthier environments, even after adjusting for these factors. The diets, the diet aging link remains strong. Why this matters. The page frames the study as part of a larger body of evidence. Lifestyle choices in midlife, diet, movement, sleep, avoiding tobacco, staying socially connected, shape how well people function decades later. The headline is essentially a shorthand for the broader conclusion. Midlife habits accumulate, and food is one of the most powerful long-term levers. For families, whatever fitness your current whatever fits your current project. Here is the core meaning of how midlife eating patterns tied to health decades later, based on the page you're viewing. The headline is saying the way people eat between ages 40 and 60 doesn't just affect how you feel now. It actively shapes your risk of chronic disease, cognitive decline, heart problems, and overall quality of life in your 70s and beyond. The surrounding page makes this point repeatedly. Midlife is a turning point, not a plateau. Metabolism slows, muscle mass declines, hormones shift, menopause, testosterone changes, nutrient absorption becomes less efficient. Because of these changes, food choices in this window have of outsized long-term effects. The page stresses that midlife is when chronic disease risk begins to rise. So dietary patterns now can either accelerate or protect against the trajectory. Why diets in midlife matter for decades. The page the page connects midlife eating to later life outcomes through several pathways. Heart health: diets high in saturated fats, sodium, and processed foods raise long-term cardiovascular risk. Anti-inflammatory whole food diets preserve arterial flexibility and lower cholesterol. Cognitive health: patterns like the Mind Mediterranean and DASH diets reduce inflammation. Cognitive stress: lowering the risk of Alzheimer's and cognitive decline. Metabolic health: whole grains, legumes, vegetables, and fermented foods improve insulin sensitivity and reduce the risk of type 2 diabetes, cancer risk. Anti-inflammatory plant-forward diets are linked to lower rates of certain cancers. The page repeatedly cites long-term studies. Framingham pre predeemed per diem nurses health study showed that midlife diets predicts health outcomes 20 to 30 years later. The headline in plain language. Based on the page, the headline means your everyday food choices in midlife create a ripple effect that determines how well you age. Your heart strength, brain sharpness, metabolic resilience, and overall vitality decades later. This is not about short-term dieting. It's about building a foundation for your 70-year-old self. How that page supports this idea. The article shows that midlife eating patterns influence biomarkers like cholesterol, blood pressure, inflammation, and insulin resistance, shape long-term risks for diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and dementia, affect muscle preservation, bone density, and hormonal balance, interact with lifestyle factors like sleep, stress, and movement. In other words, midlife diet is a predictor of long-term health span, not just lifespan. One sentence summary. The page argues that what you eat in your 40s and 50s is one of the strongest predictors of how healthy, independent, and cognitively sharp you'll be in your 70s and beyond. Decades later, based primarily on the page you're viewing, the core meaning of the headline. The page explains that people with higher vitamin D levels in midlife had significantly less tau protein in their brains nearly 2 decades later. Tau is one of the two hallmark Alzheimer's proteins, and its buildup is closely tied to memory loss and brain degeneration. So the headline is essentially saying your vitamin D status in your 30s and 40s may predict how much Alzheimer's related tau in your brain accumulates years later. What the study on the page actually found. The article describes a long-term study that followed 793 adults for 16 years. Key findings include participants with vitamin D levels above 30 in midlife had mistakenly lower tau levels on PET scans later in life. This association held even after accumulating for age, sex, and depression. Okay, folks, now I'm gonna leave the rest of the show open for comments about tonight's show. If you wish to leave me a comment, leave it in the chat below for me, please, and I will check and see what people have said about the show. For now, Gator Wellness, take care, folks.